Research settings can vary a lot depending upon the research question, participants, techniques required, and cost. We'll consider two broad categories of research settings, the field and the laboratory. Certain types of animal behavior research are done in the field, like this one here looking at communication gestures in chimpanzees in Uganda. There have been famous case studies of apes in captivity taught to use gestures and symbols to communicate with humans. This study wanted to see if this also happens amongst chimpanzees in the wild. Of course, in order to study this phenomenon, it's necessary to go there and observe them in their natural environment. You can find humans in all the habitable spaces on Earth, and some of the inhabitable places here and even beyond. Think about research on the effects of low gravity on astronauts. So field research in humans can happen in all sorts of weird and wonderful locations. This delightful study from the 1970s used shopping malls as the research setting and wanted to determine if a short-term boost in mood altered helping behavior. Participants were adults making calls from public payphones, and for half of the participants, there was a whole dime left in the coin slot. The other half got nothing. Only those that checked the coin slot were used. A Confederate watched nearby until the call was complete, then walked in the same direction as the participant and dropped an envelope full of papers. The dependent measure was whether or not they stopped to help, and those that got the boost in mood from the unexpected dime were much more likely to help. This study involved a lot of concealed observation and little control over conditions in the shopping mall, so these experimental field studies are not so common. What's more common in field research in humans is observation of behaviors in public places without interacting with the participants, like this study of pace of life in different countries. One of the measures taken was walking speed, which was collected from a distance. David Rosenhan's famous study with his pseudo-patients could be considered a field study. He was interested in diagnosis, but he didn't simply observe from a public place like the previous studies just described. His pseudo-patients were Confederates who falsely reported hearing voices, and all ended up admitted to hospital. So is this really field research? Given the diagnosis of mental illness happens in a medical setting, observing the behavior of mental health providers is best done in this setting. So this is an unusual field study where Confederates and deception were used. Another consideration for field research is the growing use of online questionnaires. These are often delivered through our phones. If a participant decides to complete the survey, the researcher has no control whatsoever over the environment where the data is collected. Most people picture a laboratory as a space for specialized equipment with highly trained people operating them. This is almost always the case for the physical sciences, like chemistry and physics, and often for the life sciences, like biology and neuroscience. However, many psychologists can get all the data they need with some participants, software, and a quiet place to click on a keyboard. Cognitive psychologists rely heavily on computer-based tasks to present stimuli and collect responses, so the research setting needs to allow for this to happen. Regardless of the specific requirements of the research, the biggest advantage to research in the lab is control. That's one of the reasons why experiments, which require much more control than descriptive and correlational studies, are typically done in labs rather than in the field. A laboratory is necessary for research using special techniques. Human brain imaging is an obvious example of this. Pretty well all animal neuroscience research is carried out in a lab, sometimes in several specialized spaces, one to measure animal behavior and another to analyze changes in the brain. Some laboratory equipment in humans is used as part of deception, like this fake shock generator I found in one of the old storage rooms in the psych department. Using props like this in a laboratory setting promotes obedience, as we learned from Milgram's shocking findings, as well as other laboratory research. Martin Orne's quest to find a tedious, boring control task for his hypnosis research revealed that participants would work on math problems for hours before giving up, an effect he attributed to the importance people place on research. From Milgram's study of obedience and Orne's tedious tasks, It's clear that human research volunteers are surprisingly willing to do things they don't want to do, which makes it difficult to study natural tendencies. Some researchers have come up with interesting ways to study natural behavior in a laboratory setting. We'll consider the most famous example. The Stanford Prison Study is considered one of the most unethical experiments in psychology because the researchers did not halt the study when it was clear some participants faced harm. The study started innocently enough. 75 men were recruited from the community to participate in a study on prison life. They completed a bunch of questionnaires and were interviewed by one of the researchers in order to get a sample with strong mental and physical health and no previous involvement in crime. Then they were randomly assigned to be either prisoners or guards for 6 days in a laboratory prison in the basement of a university building. The intention was to run the experiment for 2 weeks, but for reasons now well known, it was called off after 6 days because the prisoners were treated so badly. The researchers administered personality and mood scales and measured many dependent variables through behavioral observations. So what was the research setting like for these participants? The guards were given uniforms to wear and wore mirrored sunglasses, making it impossible for prisoners to make eye contact. They were also given other items associated with a prison guard. The prisoners wore plain smocks with no underwear and slept in a small room converted to look like a cell. They had a chain around their ankle the whole time. The guards were told to maintain order within the prison to keep it functioning. They stayed for 8-hour shifts, whereas prisoners lived in the simulated prison the whole time. Initially, prisoners and guards got along fine, but things deteriorated very quickly to the point where guards abused the participants who agreed to be prisoners, some of whom had real emotional breakdowns. What was it about this lab setting that promoted this type of behavior from the guards? They knew they were role-playing. The researchers told them so from the outset. One major contributing factor was that the researchers allowed the experiment to continue even though participants experienced real harm. The ethical conduct of the researcher is also part of the research setting, and it can have a huge effect on behavior, as shown by this study and others, like Milgram's study of obedience. Research settings must be carefully chosen to meet the needs of the research question, but they must also consider the welfare of the participants.